Hello, everyone. You're listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, forthosewelostpodcast.com, and click on the contact button, and you can reach me that way as well. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. Every story you hear in this show is full of heartbreak, grief, loss, and frustration, but they are also full of love and hope. We talk about how we are coping, we talk about how to keep the memory of our loved ones alive, and how isolating our grief is as the world wants to move on. You'll hear us talk a little bit about the vaccine and politics, and you may not agree, but I hope you'll keep listening because each person who shares their story on this show has experienced profound grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me today. I've got a really great show planned for you. Today, I'll be talking to Marilyn in Arizona. Marilyn lost her mother to COVID in March of this year after a long hospital stay. As I listened to her story when we recorded, I was astounded at how much time Marilyn spent talking to her mother via Facetime, reading her books, and telling stories, even though her mom could not answer back. The way her family balanced remote caregiving was beautiful. For context, we recorded this episode on September 24th, 2021. I also think it's important to mention that Marilyn and her husband are both working in the science field, and their family made significant changes to their life at the beginning of the pandemic. Marilyn also pushed for her mother to be retested for COVID after she'd spent weeks in the COVID ICU. And when that test came back negative, her mother was moved and her family was able to visit her in person in the hospital. I learned so much from every guest on the show, and Marilyn was no different. And with that, I'd like to welcome Marilyn to the show.
Hi, good evening, Jennifer. Yes, I'm Marilyn Raming.
Yeah, and you live in Arizona?
Yes, I live in Tempe.
All right. Yeah, I've been there many times. My sister used to live in Ahwatukee, so I used to go down and visit her quite a lot.
Yes, I'm very familiar with that place. It's very close.
So I know that you sent me a message about your mom, and she passed away in March of 2021.
Yes, she did, March 22nd of this year.
So what I'd like to do is have you go back for just briefly, the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, because did your mom live in Arizona?
Yes, so
Okay.
my parents actually moved to Arizona, both of them. They moved here 3 years ago, to the date, 3 years ago, this October, because I was gonna conceive our first child with my husband, and they, being Hispanic, our family just has really strong ties to our family, and they wanted to help take care and care for my children as they have with my brothers and several of my cousins. They've been just nurturers, caretakers their whole lives. And so they moved out here 3 years ago. And these have been the best. And this last year has been the most treacherous year of my life. But yeah, so at the start of the pandemic, I remember I have an account of everything very, very concretely with dates because I remember everything so vividly. It's all tied with my children.
Yeah, yeah, because you have little kids at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yes, I have what's now almost a 3-year-old and my other son who's turning 2,
Oh,
and
wow.
he was actually a pandemic baby. He came out at the very beginning of the pandemic. Yeah, so I remember actually hearing in the news about COVID in November, December, and my husband and I we're both in the science field. I'm a science teacher. He's a science researcher, and we're very very aware of the news and what's going on internationally, not just in our part of the world here in the United States. And I remember in January, I went to the hospital to conceive my second child, and my husband was reading the news. My child was born January 20th, and he was reading the news January 21st. And when our son was born, and he was saying, "This is going to be bad. It's gonna reach us here in the U.S." And he said he's a little worried. And having a child in my arms, I had a flood of emotions, just knowing how bad things could be, but also trusting that I would be able to take care of my family
Mhm.
and do everything that I could to do that. So I knew what we were up against. We had several talks with our newborn in our hands, and my 2-year-old at the time, 1.5-year-old's visiting with his grandma, and we made a distinct decision to, over the course of the next 6 months, not to leave our home because we wanted to care for our kids, make sure they were safe, and also really feel for this virus that was just emerging.
Mhm.
So I was on maternity leave. My husband was on paternal leave, and we didn't go anywhere for 6, 7 months. I knew the severity of it, and I wanted to see for myself, just wait it out and see what would happen, and what actions we needed to take. And while I was on my leave, yeah, I've never been so stress ridden in my life. It was a scary time having a child, a newborn, and knowing that you're in the middle of this pandemic and there are people, so many casualties, so many deaths.
Mhm.
It was really scary. I'll be honest, it still is today, even though we all had COVID, my entire family. I've gone through the loss of my mother, the most important person in my life, and it's still scary and stressful because I think about all of the other families internationally, and just the pain and suffering that goes along with this. So,
Yeah. Did your family form sort of, a pod or a bubble
yeah,
where
we did.
you did your parents live with you, or were they isolating and then would come over?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to where my father worked outside. He is a supervisor for construction and didn't have to come into close contact with his coworkers. And I was able to actually work remotely after my maternity leave, and my husband was actually also able to work remotely. And my mother would come over every day, and she would
Wow.
isolate, and we wouldn't go anywhere. We wouldn't even go to the park. We'd maybe take a walk, maybe around our block, and keep our distance, socially distance. And we would get all of our groceries delivered, or we did pick up, and we were very cautious. So we had our own bubble,
Yeah.
and we were really lucky. We didn't contract COVID till a year after it started. So my father got it. He was the first to get it. He got it in around January 12th of this year, 2020, 2021.
So why don't you go into the telling us about what happened with that? Because your mom passed away in March, and so if your dad got it in January and it went throughout your family, why don't you just tell the story of how it all happened?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I would love to share the story of my mother and our experience with COVID and everything that that entails. So my father, so at the time we were all being very careful and socially distancing, and we were continuing with our practices. We were very vigilant, and we had some little colds here and there in December, and we always got tested to make sure that we wouldn't infect anyone.
Mhm.
So, but then my father fell ill January around January 12th, 2021, and he didn't come over that week because he would always come over after work and play with his grandkids. And my mother was always here, so they'd play with them together. And then I noticed my mother, she, I noticed her energy started getting lower that next week. I remember her telling me that my father couldn't come over, and then the following week she was starting to look a little bit more lethargic, more pale, and she was having less energy. I could tell I could tell she had less energy, and she would still come over because I had to work remotely, and it got to the point where I was a little worried about her, and I told her not to come over for the next few days, and to just rest at her home. And my husband and I just watched our kids, and then I started feeling I was the next one to contract COVID. We didn't know at the time we had COVID because I didn't feel anything, and it wasn't until I got it, and then my kids got it, and then my husband.
Wow.
And we didn't realize we had COVID until I couldn't smell anything, because it started for me just as a headache, and I thought it was dehydration or lack of sleep, with my children, because they
Yeah.
wake you up at all times of the night.
Yeah.
And so I had a persistent headache for about 3 days, and at this time, my father was already feeling a little better, but my mother just kept getting worse, and to where it seemed like a really severe flu. She would stay in her bed. She stopped eating as much.
Mm.
She lost her footing one night when she was going to the restroom, and I started to get really worried about her. And at the same time, I was also trying to manage my own pain, and
Yeah.
my kids. They were all sick. My two boys had runny noses. They had a little bit of a fever, and my husband lost his sense of smell, and that was the big piece of evidence where we're like, wow, we need to get tested. And my husband got tested that day, and I would just go in and visit. I went to visit my mom and made sure she was okay. Just lay with her like I did for the last 20 years of my life, and I could notice she was having a tougher time breathing. And that night I went over her house. My husband texted, and his test came back positive when he called us. So he called me, he texted me, and he said his test was positive, and
Mm.
it my entire just world stopped. I hyperventilated a little bit. I was worried about my mom mostly because I saw my dad getting better. I remember telling my mom months before she got sick that things weren't good statistically for people that were overweight slightly, or had diabetes, or had comorbidities, or high blood pressure, because I had researched that. So I was really worried about her, and I told her that months ago that it wouldn't be good if she got it. And
So did she have diabetes?
She did. My mother
Okay.
had high blood pressure, diabetes, and she was she was just she wasn't fit. She had a little bit of additional weight, but she loved to cook, and
Yeah.
you know, that was her passion, her life, cooking. She would just always watch the Food Channel, and so she wasn't unhealthy. She would cook healthfully, but yeah, she had a passion and love for food and cooking and nourishing those around her.
Yeah,
And
and by then we did know that there were certain people that were just at higher risk, and I mean, it seems so unfair. It does seem so unfair. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no,
Keep
that's
going.
okay. Yeah, so it was really hard that week having COVID and trying to take care of my children and at the same time thinking about my parents. I immediately took my kids to their pediatrician the next day to just get another second opinion on them. I knew they looked good and I thought they were going to be okay, but I needed that reinforcement from their doctor. They checked out fine. The doctor said they'd be fine, and then I focused all my attention on my mother. And my husband recommended. He has a brother-in-law that's a ER doctor, and I have a my cousin's wife. She's a nurse practitioner in New York, and she's been in the COVID ICU since the start of the pandemic. So I immediately contacted them, and they recommended to get buy an oximeter that measures a person's oxygen levels.
Oh,
So I did that immediately, and I had my dad test my mom every few hours, and that's where I started worrying quite a lot for her and her health because her oxygen levels were getting lower. They were in the 95% and 92%. I remember calling my brother and because my parents were just gonna ride it out, just wait in their home, they weren't ones to go to the doctor immediately, and perhaps there was maybe some fear there as well of what that entailed. So I was the one in my family that actually made all the decisions, did all the research, contacted everyone, and that was all on me. And I would contact my husband's brother-in-law and my cousin, and they told me that her oxygen was getting low and that that's not a good thing, that I should probably take her into the hospital. And I remember just calling my brother, letting him know that I needed to do that. And I let my father know that night around midnight that he needed to bring my mother over the next day and that we were going to take her to the hospital together. And they actually came over the night before they went to the hospital because I had bought a bunch of just homeopathic like remedies from like Whole Foods. Just
mhm.
I thought I could help her in a different way with like zinc and vitamins, and those were those were really minor efforts in the whole scheme. She also had a pretty persistent cough that wouldn't go away, as I recall. I remember that night not sleeping very much, and my dad brought my mother over the next morning, and my kids were so excited to see her. She was their favorite person. Uh, she took care of them every day of their lives until my youngest was 1 and my oldest was about 2. So she didn't want to hug them or be around them, but I made sure that they hugged their grandma, their Lita, and I wanted to make sure that she knew how much we loved her and that she just needed to have that have that support, but also have that drive to fight this off. I thought by giving her all of that,
she would be able to make it through. So I made the decision to, excuse me, take her to the hospital with my dad, and she had her bags ready, and her energy was low, but she had a peace with her. She always had that. She was a woman of faith, had her religion, and she seemed very peaceful in the process. She never seemed scared. Her faith uh, gave that to her, and I think for that I'm very thankful. Her and my dad have that, and so they went. She went to the hospital, and that was one of the most tumultuous days of my life. Just hugging my mother and telling her to be strong, and that I was going to call her and be calling the nurses and doctors every few hours to make sure she was okay. And that's exactly what I did. She was in the hospital the next 2 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she went into the hospital January 23rd, and she was in there for 2 months. Um,
Oh, was your father able to be with her?
no, she was. They at the time it was the third surge, I believe, in the nation. So they didn't allow visitors for the first 4 weeks that she was in the hospital. No, for the first 3 weeks. So my father and I weren't able to visit. My brother was in New York, so but the first 2 weeks she was there, she was able to FaceTime, and she had her phone with her. And the first few days, she was on a nasal cannula that just supplied oxygen through her nose. And they were just in the process of getting all of her vitals every day and seeing how she does. She was in a progressive care unit, so she was there, and things just started to get worse for her health wise. She stopped eating solid food because she had to go on to a higher flow oxygen respirator, and she could only take shakes and smoothies, and she
Yeah.
would get winded when she would take off her mask. And I made a point to FaceTime her every day to check up on her, and I would also contact her nurses every day, twice a day.
Did you feel like the hospital was helpful and willing, or did you feel at times like they were overloaded?
They were certainly overloaded, but my mother was my priority.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to get on their bad side, the nurses, because I knew that her life depended on it. And I also knew the stress that they were under. So I was compassionate about that and understanding. But once again, my mother was my priority. So I made a point to call and check on her vitals and speak with the nurses every day. And they, a couple times, they got a little, they weren't as cooperative.
Mhm.
They didn't want me to call her. They couldn't talk to me because it sounded really stressful for them. I would always hear alarms going off in the back, and nurses shifting, and I could tell it was a very stressful time for them,
Yeah.
and I understand that. And my mother being in her room, I would at the time when she was in the progressive care unit, I just wanted to make sure she knew how loved she was and how cared for she was. So I would always drop things off on a daily basis, magazines, flowers, activities for her to do. But her health started to deteriorate. She wasn't able to do very much, and she wasn't able to FaceTime me for the last few days. And about 11 days into her progressive care stay, I remember feeling a jolt in the middle of the night around 1 a.m. And my phone wasn't on, but I had it on every other night, just not that night. And I woke up that next morning and I had a message on my phone that they had moved her to, she had to be put on a ventilator.
Mm.
And that was the hardest thing to hear. And one of the most, yeah, tumultuous messages of my life to have heard that. Days leading up to that, I knew there. I did all my research. I think every night I was a mess, just calling my brother. He was or my the ER doctor in the family, and just discussing my mother's statistics and all what her vitals suggest. And that was really scary because I knew what the survival rate was once intubated, and it wasn't
Mm.
very good, and it still isn't very good nationwide.
Yeah.
Although they don't, unfortunately, what's really interesting coming from a science background is they didn't publish the statistics. I think because they don't want to alarm the public.
Mhm.
Because being a science teacher, it'd be really easy to publish the data and to get data on a hospital. How many people out of 100 that are intubated make it out?
Mhm.
And that data wasn't published and it wasn't out. And I just knew that it was very low.
Yeah.
Now there's data out on it, and I feel like that should have been in the public's eye a lot sooner than 2 years into the pandemic.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so my mother was, I got the phone call that my mother was intubated, and I kind of, I had that moment of, of anger because I didn't want to believe that she needed that. I thought
Mhm.
she could just stay on that high flow and that her body could heal. But it got to the point where her oxygen level dipped down to the 70s
Oh.
for a few seconds, and the ICU nurse had to make that call. And I understand that now, but the way that the nurse came off was not the way that somebody should be told that their loved one's gonna go and be intubated. Because I called that next day and he said that she needed to be intubated and that we were just prolonging the reality.
Oh.
Or he said prolonging the inevitable.
Oh.
And it's like, well, really, was that, perhaps it wasn't inevitable. And I wish there could have been other words used
Mhm.
to describe that shift, that she was going to be intubated. But I needed to make sure that all the data and all her vitals suggested that she needed to be intubated. So I remember calling the head nurse of the progressive care unit, the head nurse of the COVID ICU, and they said that this was the next best step because it would give her body some time to rest
Mhm.
without having to work so hard to breathe. So looking back, and I guess I want to provide that comfort to everyone's whose loved one needs to be intubated. When people get to that level, their bodies need to rest because they're working so hard to breathe and they can't breathe. It's hard to see that. I saw my mother through FaceTime every day just deteriorate in that way, and her body wasn't able to fight back, even with all the support and love that she had. And but my family and I didn't stop there. We My mother took care of us. She took care of me for 34 years of my life. She took care of my brother for 38 years of his. My father for wow, they knew each other since they were about 7 years old, so the 60
Oh,
years that they
wow.
were together. So we didn't stop fighting for her even when she was in the ICU. I knew the importance of just knowing that your family was there, even though that you may be unconscious. I know on some level people can feel that and understand that. So I would FaceTime my mother while she was intubated, still every day, and I would read to her and talk to her like I always had, and just let her know that she was doing a great job and to just keep fighting and to keep trying her best. And I would do that usually when the nurses were available. So that was at about like 11 p.m. or like 5 a.m.
Mhm.
So for those yeah, those 2 months I definitely didn't sleep well.
Yeah.
Yeah, having my kids and then also trying to be there for my mom. So, I would do that every day, and so would my brother and dad. I would take turns with them, scheduling them to talk with my mom, and it was really heart wrenching to see her just laying down and unable to move, and um, that was really hard for the first week or two. On the third week, they were able to lower her sedation, and she was able to open her eyes and at least see me on the tablet. And keep in mind, this tablet that we use, the iPad, I had to drop it off, and I had to have the nurses set it up every day, and they were so kind to do that
Oh, that's good.
because the hospital didn't have access to any of that. So I made sure that I was able to see her every day. I wouldn't have been able to sleep every day without having to see her if I couldn't see her. So I
Yeah.
needed that. I needed to know that I could at least see her.
Yeah, it's good that they did that for you. They set that up and they helped you with that. That's amazing.
Yeah, because I know a lot of people weren't able to see their loved ones, and I can't imagine what that would be like to. Yeah, I mean to imagine you're somebody you love, drop them off in a hospital, and not to be able to see them for days or weeks or even months.
Yeah, with my mom, there was a limited number of iPads. And so we could call once a day. And they didn't even tell us about the iPads for the week that my mom was in the COVID nursing home. And then when I finally asked, like, can we see her somehow? They said, oh, well, yeah, but they had a limited number of them. So they were very helpful. Her facility was really wonderful where she was for the last week or so, but it felt rushed. I mean, for me, it felt like, okay, here's the iPad. The nurse would set it down so we kind of could see my mom from a side profile. And then you would see the nurse come in the door like 15, 20 minutes later and be like, okay, are you done? And we would say goodbye and they would take it to someone else.
Yeah, yeah, I had that experience, and the nurses would set it up, and I would actually tell them like, "Hey, I may be here for a while. Just set it up, and I'll turn it off, or yeah, I'll turn it off when I'm ready."
Yeah.
Because I would talk to her for a good half hour every night, read her books or stories, share memories with her. The nurses would come in and out, they'd check her vitals, and I'm sure some people would think it would be awkward to have the nurses listen in, but I didn't care. I needed my mom to hear me
Yeah.
and to know that I was there with her and that she was doing a good job and that I was making sure that she was going to be okay.
Yeah.
So we did that, and I wanted to one day 3 weeks into her stay in the ICU COVID station. Let's see, one day I asked the nurse how long she would be COVID positive, and if they could move her to the non-COVID ICU. So that way, at least all the nurses didn't have to have all these masks and suits on that could be scary for people to see when
Mm-hmm.
they're in this very vulnerable position. They decided to conduct a test. She was negative, and they ended up moving her to a COVID-free ICU, which was a good step up.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I'm a little disheartened by the medical field because I was consulting an ER doctor in Utah, my family friend, my family, and then also a nurse practitioner in New York to get all of this insight when I wish the hospital here, nurses and doctors would have been more proactive. Like, yeah, let's test her for COVID sooner and we can get her out of here sooner.
Yeah.
Or have them reach out to family. I was the one that called every day. I wasn't gonna wait for them to call me. I needed to hear how my mother was doing. I needed to know. So I was very persistent, and yeah, because they wouldn't have called. So I wish they would have been a little bit more proactive in their jobs, but I also understand having family in the medical field. I do understand the stresses that they were under and still are under. So
So after your mom was moved into a regular ICU, was your dad able to go see her? Were you able to go see her?
yeah, so thank goodness the COVID numbers started to go down by in our state here in Arizona by the first week of February, and
Mhm.
February 8th was the day we were able to go in and see her. I called the nurse, and she said that they were allowing visitors now, and that was like it felt like the best day of my life. I was going to be able to go see my mother, and that really was one of the best days of my life because I was able to go see her after not seeing her for 3 weeks and just worrying about her consistently. I was able to go see her, and at least I was able to physically check on her and be there for her.
Yeah.
So I called my dad and brother right away. I had my husband come home and watch the kids, and I rushed over to the hospital. It's less than a mile away from my house, and I was so happy to see her. She wasn't in the best position. She had the tubes in her throat, um, the breathing tube for her, and she was sedated. But I was able to see her at least, and that was really comforting. I was able to hold her hand, and unfortunately, I wasn't too happy at the state of her physical appearance that I saw her when I went in. One of her arms was like lodged underneath her back,
Mm.
and could tell it was there for like hours. And when I told the nurse that, he was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, let's move it." And he moved her arm from under her body, and it was severely swollen and like sweaty and wet. And I realized I needed to go in every day and make sure that she was getting the care that she deserved
Yeah.
and given that fighting chance. So every day from that moment forward, my brother actually flew in from New York, and we actually took turns, the three of us, going in every other day. I would go in one day, then my father would go in another, and then my brother would go in another day, and we would check her stats, her X-rays. We would hold her hand and just be there for her. And I'm really grateful that I was there for. Excuse me. Just grateful that I was there for her for the last 6 weeks of her life, and that I was able to be there to support her. And
Mhm.
she had a lot of really good days to where they were able to lower her sedation and she would be conscious and awake. And then we'd have some ups and downs to where her body, her breathing would get uh, perhaps wasn't sync with the machine, so they'd have to sedate her a little more. And then she got to the point where she needed a tracheoscopy, a tracheotomy, I believe, where you get the breathing tube surgery directly into your throat.
Yeah.
So the following week, we were able to see her. She had to get that done. That was around week 8 of her stay in the hospital, and that was hard to see, to know that I wasn't gonna be able to talk to her again. The days that she had good days to where they would continue to lower her sedation, and I would bring in signs and pictures, and I would try to communicate with her, and she would try to communicate with me as well. The doctors and nurses say that she perhaps wasn't entirely there, and perhaps she would lose some of her capabilities,
Mm-hmm.
but she actually was still really strong till the day that she passed. Um, my mother was very lucid, very present. She was able to move her fingers, which was really outstanding for being bedridden for 8, and then eventually, 8, 10 weeks.
Wow.
She was still able to move her fingers and gesture and nod her head and respond to commands, and so she was very, very present, very there, very aware. So most of the people that are intubated can be and are even weeks into being intubated. I would show her pictures on my cell phone, and she remembered her grandsons. Yeah, it was really nice to see her those last few weeks. Yeah, I unfortunately I was always very hopeful. I It's just it's possibly my personality, to not give up, to not have that endless optimism, to be positive till the very end. I had that until her last day in the hospital. Is that I knew it was a possibility. I read it. I read in several articles that there were some people that pulled through, people that needed ECMO treatment, like that's out of body blood transfusions, and they were intubated. And I read a bunch of stories to where there were people that made it out. So I was very hopeful till the very last day, the very last breath that she took. I was so hopeful. We were talking to the doctor too. The pulmonologist, he said he would consider transferring her to another hospital once she was a little bit more stable. So there were signs that she was getting better, but the way that COVID works, you have a few steps forward and a step back,
Yeah.
few steps forward and another step back. And it was a roller coaster for those 2 months. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the end, was it something that your family decided, or did not that she passed suddenly, but did it just happen?
Um,
I guess what I'm asking is if she had the tracheotomy, then she was having a machine help her breathe. Was it your family's decision, or did she pass away while the machines were working still?
right. So this is a part of. So there was an issue with her hospitalization actually a week before she passed away. Um, they were lowering her sedation to where she was almost entirely off of everything a week
Mm.
before. And I was able to talk to her in full sentences, gesture. I was super hopeful. And the day that I was there, I could tell her breathing was a little off
Mhm.
to where she was using her, not her lungs, but all of the muscles outside of her stomach. And she was working too hard to breathe. So I spoke to the pulmonologist about that and the nurses, and they recommended to put her back on sedation and specifically a paralytic. Or no, they recommended to put her back on a sedation.
Mhm.
And because the last few days they were doing sedation vacations where they would take her off and we were able to talk to her and she was awake for several hours of the day, but then they would put her back on so she could rest and breathe.
Mhm.
But the nurse didn't see that the doctor had put that on the board to not do a sedation vacation that day or that week because he wanted to make sure that her breathing was synced again.
Mm.
And the nurse actually ended up taking her off that morning, and her breathing became very labored, very erratic. And my brother was there. And as a result of that, she had to be immediately put on a paralytic to where her body had to be paralyzed and the machine had to do all of the breathing.
Mm.
So that was actually a hospitalization error and issue that occurred.
Mhm.
And had the nurse read that note, my mother wouldn't have been put on that paralytic. I don't know what the outcome would have been either way, but that was the result of her action. And she had to be put on the paralytic. And then within 3 days, uh, that next day, actually, she had a fever and her breathing became even more erratic. And on the final day that she passed, it was it was her body that gave out. It wasn't the machine. It was just her body. It was my day to go into the hospital. It was 3 days after my birthday, and I the the nurse called that morning and told me that I needed to give in to see her as soon as possible. She wasn't doing too well, and I had this sense of just uneasiness throughout my entire body. I knew something was wrong, but I knew that I knew that if I could go see her, I could possibly help and save her and be with her. I went to the hospital immediately. I still remember everything very, very detailed. It was very surreal just seeing all the nurses lined outside of her room. There were probably a dozen people outside of her room and about half a dozen inside her room. And they were performing CPR when I got there. I told my brother to come in right away since he was still here in Arizona, and I told him to call my dad to have him come in as well. And I was there. I was holding my mother's hand for the last. It was around 11:14 a.m. and I was holding her hand for the last few minutes of her life. And while they performed CPR on her, and the doctor gave several orders and commands, and he told me several times that at this point, with the amount of CPR that she's been given, her brain could be damaged, but I still didn't want to give up. I told him we still
Yeah.
needed to do whatever we could for her, and that we can do it a little longer. And they did CPR for about 10 more minutes, and they would take turns with the nurses doing CPR, and she would have a pulse, and then it would be gone. And yeah, then my brother came in that last minute. My father, and then So my brother and I were there when she passed, and the chaplain stayed in the room, and all of the doctors and nurses made their way outside. And I watched my mother's body and my brother just next to her. He oh gosh, I don't know how to describe his uh, just that whole experience. Yeah, just watching my brother. I couldn't believe it was actually happening. I was still trying to take it all in, watching my brother um, hold my mother's body and cry, and I was trying to figure out where I went wrong, what I could have done more, and and then my father came in, and that was really painful to see my father and his reaction to seeing my mother pass. Yeah, it's all still very, very real for me, very vivid, and
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's been
images. It's been
6 months.
6 months and a day
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
Yeah. Was your family able to have a memorial service or a funeral for your mom?
Yeah, we were able to do a memorial for her. We did a funeral at their ward there, and we held it. I believe it was a week after, and it's still very hard, but that was one of the hardest weeks of my life, I would say.
Mhm.
Just trying to lose really the most influential person in your life, and then to plan a funeral.
Yeah. Yeah, so unexpectedly too. Like at your age with, little kids, it's just not what you're thinking. It's just not what you're thinking you're going to have to do. Was the funeral was there social distancing? For me, I mean, I had to go home. I had to stay home. We were so isolated up here and I couldn't go hug any of my mom's sisters or her brother or anything even though they lived nearby. Was that helpful in a way to be able to have that experience in during the pandemic?
I would say it was.
Okay.
Yeah, we were able to have the funeral, and my family flew in, the ones that could, from the East Coast, and we had several family friends that came to attended the funeral, and several of my parents' church friends and members attend from their congregation. And yeah, it's not something you ever think that you have to do at 34,
Right.
34, or even any age younger. It's not something you think about, but that was helpful to have a community and family and friends there when the last entire 2 years has been pretty isolating. The last year and
Yeah.
a half, um, I think I think more than anything, what this experience has taught me in COVID is the importance of, I think, being there for others,
Mhm.
and not just your immediate family, but your neighbors, your for me, my students, your neighbors, your um, just people on the street.
Yeah.
You don't know what anyone's going through. You don't know what hardship, what mountain they're climbing, and the least you can do is just be there for them. Just be a kind and positive person in their lives. And
Yeah.
really, that's how my mother was. That's how she actually led her life every day of her life. She was the most positive, kind, warm, nurturing, sweet person in the world. Um, she helped raise dozens of children, and she was she was a Christian in every sense of the word. I remember her. I remember this is just like a perfect example of who my mother was. We would go to for example, the bank when I was a child, and my mother would sit there or stand there and talk with the teller, or at the grocery store, just speak with the cashiers, and she would always talk to them and smile, and she would make sure she left the conversation very positive and that they were happy, and that they felt seen and heard and cared for.
Yeah.
And I would always ask her like, "Hey, why do you waste your time? Like we have to go do these things." I was a teenager. I was young. Um I didn't know any better. I was like, "Hey, why do you waste your time? We have to go do all these other things." And I was wrapped up in my own world, and she would say, "Because you don't know what they're going through, and if I can make their lives better or make them smile or laugh, then that makes me feel good." Yeah, she was just a joy to be around. Just this amazing, nurturing mother in person to not just her children, but her brothers, her four brothers, aunts, cousins. She
Yeah.
would always, growing up, she would always have all of our family and friends and people from church over, and she would just make these big meals, and always she loved cooking and serving everyone, and that was her love language, was service and cooking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Something caught my dog's attention. I don't know if you can hear him, but he's barking in the other
yeah,
room.
yeah, that's quite fun.
So it hasn't been a year, and you are going through, well, and your mom passed away just before your birthday,
No, it was 3 days after.
3 days after. So, so how are things like holidays and birthdays, and you still have like Thanksgiving and Christmas. Christmas was the hardest for me because my mom loved Christmas so much. How are you coping with that?
To be honest, Jennifer, it's not even just the holidays because my mother passed in March, so we haven't had many holidays really.
Yeah,
I know we have Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up and Halloween, and but I'll be honest, really every day is for me still a struggle. I see religious people like my father and dad and church members. They have that to hold on to, that they can possibly see their loved one, and they have that sense of peace that provides. Um, I don't have that, and I think it's been yeah I think it's been just really I think it's just been challenging to navigate through this time. Just
yeah.
every day still is challenging. The first few weeks were the hardest. I would just rack my head about everything that I could have done more. Um, how I could have possibly helped her more. Yeah, but currently, right now, one thing that does help is I've signed up to the through the COVID Grief Network. They do grief group counseling, and that's been really nice to connect with other individuals that have lost loved ones to COVID, and that's a good place to start.
Is that the COVID connections or is it a different group?
Yeah, I believe it's through COVID Connections. Yeah,
Okay.
and something else that's helped is I've wanted to take a political stance throughout all of this because of the way that everything was handled, specifically in Arizona and with our governor, Governor Ducey, and the resigning president at the time. So I realized I can't do this on my own. So I found this group. It was let's see. Oh, let's see my brain. Oh goodness, here let me look it up. Sorry, my brain is
It's okay. I have the same kind of thing happen with my brain too.
let's see. It's the marked by COVID. Sorry about that. Yeah,
Okay.
it's the last few years of having young children and not sleeping. These yeah moments. But yeah, it's so that has also helped quite a bit is the marked by COVID movement. I've donated just a bit of just monetary income to them, and they're doing a lot of great work with to honor and to provide a voice for those people whom have lost loved ones to COVID, and also for future legislation on how pandemics are handled, and also to hold those accountable whom should be held accountable for their actions or
Yeah.
lack of actions throughout the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I became active up here. I wrote my governor. I wrote every senator and congressman. I don't know how many emails. I mean, I would just email them almost weekly about new things that were happening here. It helped me. I mean, it helped me, and I shared my mom's story every single time. I just, uh, yeah, I feel like so many people in positions of power uh, made what they thought were the best decisions at the time, but then it things changed so fast. Those decisions obviously weren't the right ones, but then they were so entrenched, I feel like, that they wouldn't say like, "Oh, we made a mistake, let's do this." Or let's change this, or let's try this. I just
Exactly.
the whole thing was just beyond frustrating for me.
Well, additionally, it's I think for me, for from what I can gather, it seems as though these people in power, in these positions of power, decided to value the economy and opening
Mhm.
up the states rather than value people's lives and their families.
Yeah.
So that's from what I can gather from my observations. Because I think if their values were put elsewhere, it would have been very different.
Mhm.
I look at states that were a little bit more conservative, more careful of their citizens, and they handled it a lot better than certain states like Arizona.
Yeah.
These people need to be held accountable for their actions. I mean, we're all held accountable as citizens for our actions. If you run a red light, you get a ticket.
Yep.
Somebody should be held accountable for the actions that were taken throughout this pandemic or the lack of it. Now
Yeah.
we're nearing at this point it's October or it's sorry, September 23rd, and we're nearing close to 700,000 deaths just in
Yeah.
the US.
Yeah. Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
It is
Uh,
at the beginning of the pandemic, there were a few research scientists. They said that if this pandemic was handled appropriately, there shouldn't be more than 100,000 deaths.
mhm. Well, and you're coming at it from being a science teacher, so
Exactly.
yeah. Have you submitted or sent your mom's name into any, of the memorials? Because there's grassroots memorials all over, and I know Marked by COVID has done some of those things, and there have been some Yellow Heart memorials, but have you submitted your mom's name or, had her picture painted? I know those yellow hearts on Instagram with those photos. Have you done anything like that?
Yeah, those are beautiful. I've seen all
They
of that.
are.
I've seen little memorials on beaches, and they've been transferred to local parks. And I did send her name out to the National Memorial, which was just put up a few days ago, I believe.
Yeah.
And so that's one way to help memorialize my mother. Um,
Yeah. So we don't forget.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I
exactly.
think with everything going on and how quickly things are changing, I think so many people want to go back to normal that I just I just don't want I don't want our moms forgotten.
Exactly. There is no normal. I think for those
Right.
of us whom have lost someone or know of someone who's lost someone, at the same time, I don't think, to be honest, I don't think there is many people that can relate unless you have lost someone to COVID.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
is so gut wrenching, and all these people should still be here.
They should
And,
be.
there's just no way around that. Just processing
Yeah.
this grief of that these people should be here. They shouldn't
Yeah.
have been lost. They shouldn't be gone. And
Yeah. Yeah, I firmly believe that if it weren't for COVID, my mom would still be in her memory care. You
exactly.
know, she had a lot of life, even though she had Alzheimer's. She had a lot of life left in her. And
And that was
uh,
taken away from us.
yeah,
And that's painful.
it is. It is. So
Yeah.
you're a science teacher. I'm going to ask you this question I ask everybody. What do you say to people who tell you COVID isn't real?
Wow. So I'm a science teacher, and I experienced COVID firsthand. Luckily, in the circles that I'm around, it's all mostly science teachers or educators, or my husband's circles. They're all researchers, all
Mhm.
scientists. Um, all of our family, our extended relatives, friends, they're all educated and are well aware of the reality of COVID. So I unfortunately haven't had, I think I only had one experience over the course of the last few years that I've had to take a step back, because everyone in my circles that I surround myself with understand the gravity of the situation. Yeah, there was a lady at the park just a few weeks ago. I asked her. She was over. She was a little overweight, and I asked her if she received her vaccine. She was there with her grandkids. She said she didn't, and that the vaccine is causing a lot of health issues, and it's a way for the government to track people, and something absurd along those
Mhm.
lines. I didn't choose to get into a battle. That's not what I want to do. I just instantly, internally, felt a deep sense of sadness and pain because I don't want her to get COVID, and I also don't want her family to suffer
Yeah.
any of the pain that us 700,000 have or more.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, what I feel internally, when I hear someone that is against getting the vaccine, or even that COVID is a thing. Yeah, so I just didn't choose to battle her or get into an argument with her about it. She seemed very very headstrong in her thoughts, in her ways. So
From your stories of your mom, it sounds like she probably would have done the same thing, just smiled and hoped for the best for that lady.
yeah, yeah, just hope for the best. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for people who, like, I don't know a single other person here in Oregon in my life of people, like, nobody who's lost anybody to COVID. And so there's so many people who could just go through this whole thing and never experience this kind of grief. And it's an isolating, very lonely grief.
Extremely isolating.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I appreciate you talking to me tonight. I know we had it scheduled for a couple days ago and I had to cancel that, so I really appreciate your flexibility
Of course. Thank you, Jennifer.
and I will keep you in my thoughts, especially with the holidays coming up.
Mm,
And
yeah, certainly. Same here.
it's
Yeah.
it's
I wish you the best, and thank you
yeah.
for starting up these podcasts. It's been really nice to listen to them
Oh,
and
I'm so
to
glad.
listen to the stories, and really just have that sense of community. Uh,
Mhm.
like we've both mentioned, it's a little isolating, and I don't think my husband can't even relate. And he loved my mother so much and knew her, and
Yeah.
he has a deep sense of pain of her loss. But I don't think there's anything like losing your person, your people to
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, I experienced that too. My husband's mom died 10 years ago, but I just don't feel like at times, like, my grief, I don't feel like he relates, like, he doesn't understand. It is it's a thing. It's just so it's hard to put into words the feeling of it, 'cause
Yeah, entirely. Yeah, I agree.
yeah. Yeah, and I do this because it helps me so much.
Yeah,
Every single time I finish, one of these episodes or I talk to somebody on the
yeah,
phone, it just helps. So I'm so glad that you took the time to tell your story because it's gonna help a lot of people.
yeah. Certainly, Jennifer. It really does. I think there's a sense of connection and that sense of community to know that yeah, you're not in it alone.
Yeah,
People felt really deeply for their loved ones, and they tried hard, and there was no way around it. So it's
yeah.
definitely very cathartic. So thank you for your effort in this. It means a lot. So
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this podcast finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.